So chapter 22 carries on with our discussion of plants and botany, and really focuses mostly on angiosperms. So the last chapter kind of went through the different kinds of plants, and this one's really going to talk about plant structure, growth, and reproduction with a real focus on angiosperms. They really do dominate the land. Most plants that you can think of are angiosperms, even though we talked lovingly, I think, about all the mosses and ferns and conifers or gymnosperms. Um, the gymnosperms come back in the lab a little bit as we dissect a pine cone, but really what we're going to talk about here are those flowering plants. Most of the food sources for us are really from a 100 domesticated angiosperms. And so if you think back to your favorite plants, they were probably angiosperms. If you can't come up with like the flower or the seed or the fruit, it's probably just not as flashy as, say, like an apple tree and those domesticated angiosperms. So they are categorized, they are grouped, of course they are, biology loves grouping things, by the number of the cotyledons. And so cotyledons are the seed leaves, so the nutrient sources for that developing embryo. And so you've seen this, if you've cracked open a peanut, you see that there's two halves to the peanut, and then there's a tiny little embryo in here. And so these are the cotyledons. Now, we could talk about how there are monocots and there are dicots. What I just drew could be a bean or a peanut. There are two cotyledons. So those are eudicots, or sometimes called dicots. Your textbook changed from one publication to the next, and now it says eudicots everywhere, where it used to say dicots, and that makes sense to me because there's often two cotyledons on a dicot. So a monocot, in contrast, these would be things like orchids, bamboos, palms, lilies, all these kinds of things, and I like thinking about corn. And so corn has the corn kernel, and then there's the developing embryo down here, and so it has one cotyledon. So those are monocots. So corn would be another example of a monocot. There are other characteristics of the two monocots and dicots, and we're going to take a look at those next. We have a chart, and then we also have some pictures, which are great. And I think often with these ones, like I've said about a lot of things, it's coming up with examples that fit, that really help kind of connect you to this information. So the characteristics, we could talk about the number of cotyledon, and so we did. On the monocot, there's one. On the dicot, there's two. We could also talk about the pattern of the leaves. And so if we think about corn or grass, they've got or lilies, that's another good one. There's a parallel leaf venation. So what that means, it's like a blade of grass with the parallel veins in it. In contrast to that, eudicots or dicots have a branched leaf venation. So that would be more like, you know, a maple leaf or an apple tree leaf or a lot of other leaves are out there. They could be lobed, they could be branched. This idea though, we're looking at the vein pattern here. The next thing is a little less obvious, and this is the arrangement of the vascular tissues. And so these are vascular plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms were the lycophytes, pterophytes were the vascular plants. And so these monocots have a scattered or random vascular arrangement, whereas the eudicots or dicots have a ring, so it's organized. And this one's more random. And again, we've got some pictures coming up that might help you with this. The number of flower parts, this is a telltale sign and kind of handy when you're identifying plants, would be flower parts in multiples of 3, and you can think of lilies for that. Or in contrast, flower parts in numbers of 4 or 5 or multiples thereof. So you can think of compound flowers like a daisy, where there's a lot of petals, and we don't have to do the I love you not thing, or he loves me not thing, to count the petals. It's just got multiples here. The last one here would be a fibrous root, and so this is kind of like out. And if you think of corn roots, I grew up where corn was grown all the time. They kind of spread out as opposed to a carrot, which has a taproot. And so there's a long That's my carrot. Um, a long one there. So again, with this one, I think corn or grasses, if you've ever pulled up sod, or a carrot. Okay, so the pictures of these, even though I've drawn some of them, we've got monocots across the top, we've got dicots or eudicots down the bottom here. And again, your textbook changed this. And I really love this image, so I kept it in here. Those are the pictures. And so with these, you do have some examples given. So here would be a lily, right? We could talk about corn. We could talk about grass, all as monocots. And then the dicots, this flower is a columbine. They'll grow wild. They also self-seed like crazy. A maple tree maybe. Maybe a carrot if you want to think of something that has that taproot. And like I said, these vascular bundles, these stems, here we have a random arrangement. And here we have a ring arrangement. And so that's what we're talking about with these vascular tissues and how they're organized. Okay, so long ago, we talked about how there was a hierarchy in biology, and we like organizing things. We're going to dive into this hierarchy in plants. So at the top of our hierarchy, we'd have the plant. And a step down, we'd have organs of the plant. Below that, we'd have the tissue level and then the cell level. And so this PowerPoint is kind of organized into this as a hierarchy. So we're going to delve deep, and we're starting here with the organs of a plant. Now this was listed in the chapter 19 one, and I think I maybe told the panda joke about eat shoots and leaves, but it's not eat shoots and leaves, it's roots, shoots, and leaves, or roots, stems, and leaves. Those are the organs of a plant. And so we talked about those as being key adaptations for land plants. And so, we're going to kind of echo that. And again, with this hierarchy as one of those themes in biology right from the beginning of this course that we focused on. And so again, with these, we've talked about this before. It's all kind of common sense, what the roots do, what the shoots do, and what the leaves do. It really does allow for nutrients and products of photosynthesis and water to get around the plant and serve the plant's need and keep it alive. An image of that, if you weren't sure what roots were, shoots were, or leaves were. So here we have roots, shoots, or stems, and the leaf. Those were the three organs. This would be a dicot or a eudicot because of the branched pattern, because of the 5 petals, and because of that taproot. So dicot or eudicot. And another one here, we talked about form and function. Look at all these root hairs. And so all of those root hairs allow increased surface area for nutrient adaptation. So this is a form and function connection. You could also say form and function is the stem holds the leaves up, and the leaves are large for catching all the sunlight for photosynthesis. There's so many. The next one that we could take a look at here, this is actually from chapter 19, but I thought it was good to kind of put some of the diagrams all together. So this is chapter 19, and these were the things that we talked about. So the leaves, we talked about the cuticle covering to prevent water loss. We've talked about stomata when we talked about photosynthesis, because that's what allows the gases to go in and out, and we talked about how they close up and those C4 and CAM adaptations. We have lignin. So lignin is a woody type protein that makes, plants stand up, basically. We've got our stem, that was that other organ, and then we have the roots. And so again, with these ones, we're talking about vascular plants, and so that's all about the transportation. A lot in this PowerPoint is really going to focus on growth and reproduction. So in angiosperms, we have flowers, and then we also have seeds. And so we'll talk a lot about the reproductive structures as we go through this chapter 22. if we can identify different parts of plants, we can also see how they are wildly changed or variations in them. We've got adaptations. And so we could modify roots such as large tap roots, and you could think carrots, turnips, good old turnip over here, sugar beets, any of those root vegetables. I'm making this video in the fall, and fall is the time for all those root vegetables in my mind. We could talk about stem modifications, and some of these get a little bit weird. So stem modifications, we could talk about tubers being potatoes. I always thought they were root modifications, but they are stem modifications. Strawberries are also uh, a stem modification, but specifically those runners that allow strawberries to reproduce asexually. If you've ever grown strawberries, you're familiar with that. I have a strawberry bed that typically overruns its borders all the time, and I have to take the new plants out just to give room for the ones so that they'll reproduce. Cactus stem, again, for water storage, and then also those leaf modifications. So those three organs can have, various forms depending on the environments that these plants live in. The last of the leaf modifications would be tendrils. So any vines that climb or cling, such as a pea plant, a pole bean, those kinds of things, have ways of hanging on as they climb up. So, this isn't an exhaustive list. There's all kinds of weird and wacky things out there in these adaptations that are modifications of those different plant parts. And trying to kind of figure out what part of the plant had originally been those things. I mean, in class we had some questions about onions and garlic. And so there's other ones that you can look up to kind of figure out, which organ has been modified for that particular food plant. Here's some images of those. There's that strawberry trying to escape my strawberry bed. That's not my strawberry, but you know what I mean. Tubers and rhizomes, those stem modifications. Okay, so those are the organs, the roots, shoots, and leaves, and now we're into the tissues. So the tissues are more specific, and basically they have the outer layer, like we have the epidermis, so that's the dermal tissue. We have the epidermis of our body, that's our skin and stuff. So we have the outer, and then we also have the vascular tissue, because you remember we're talking about these as vascular plants. And so these are the vascular tissues, the xylem and the phloem, and they're important for carrying materials around. So we have transport. And then, catch-all, we have everything else. So everything else, as far as a tissue, is called ground tissue. So this is food production, all of those cells that photosynthesize, everything that lies between the dermal and the vascular tissue. So everything else. Like I say, biology loves categorizing things, and sometimes we get these catch-all sort of categories. So we had our organs, our tissues, and now we're going to talk about our cells. This one's just showing again, those different tissues, and again with it, it's gone from the eudicot to the monocot, showing that organization of the vascular tissue. And we've got the vascular tissue, we've got the dermal tissue, and we've got the ground tissue. So the ground tissue here is in yellow. The dermal, the outside, is in brown, and then the vascular, the xylem and the phloem, is in purple. So there's 5 different kinds of plant cells. Some of them have some wacky names, and I find that these are easier to make sense of if you have something to connect them to as far as an example. And so they have weird names. The first ones are parenchyma cells. And so parenchyma cell are the most abundant cell type. They're alive at maturity. They perform functions, so photosynthesis, food and water storage. We've already seen an example of these as the mesophyll cells from chapter 7 when we talked about photosynthesis. Here we talked about those mesophyll cells in the middle of the leaves, and that's a good example of a parenchyma cell. They really are the most abundant cell type, and yeah, they're alive at maturity. So the next kinds would be the collenchyma cells. So the collenchyma cells are more about support. And so they again are alive at maturity. And the example I have here is the strings in celery. Or you could think about, any of those branching patterns of a leaf. So the cells that line those veins on the outside would be collenchyma cells. The last ones would be sclerenchyma cells. Those words are really hard to say. I practiced them ahead of time. And these ones are different because they're dead at maturity. So these are really, the woody cells. They are really about the rigid support. And so lignin is a protein. It is important for that woodiness of plants or trees that we think of. And there's two kinds of sclerenchyma cells. So there's the fibers, which is more about, that woodiness. And then these ones are interesting. Again, it's the fall when I'm making this video, and pears are in season. So if you've ever eaten a very ripe pear and noticed a slight graininess to it, that's because of sclerid cells. And so those sclerids again are, fibrous. They're shorter, but they have that sort of texture that I think of when I eat a pear. So those are parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma cells. The last two are ones that we've sort of seen before. We've got the xylem and the phloem here being the water conducting and the food conducting cells. And so the xylem was that food water conducting cell, and the food was the phloem. And those are words that we've seen time and time again. So anytime that we can think back to other things we've done and reinforce those connections, I think it's worthwhile. So we've talked about those ones. They're both dead at maturity to kind of parallel. Oh, sorry, dead at maturity and alive at maturity. Sorry about that. And the cool thing about these food conducting cells is that you have these sieve type cells. Whoop. Oh, there we could tell how to do it. So the sieve tube members are the sieve cells, and then beside it we have a companion cell. So this companion cell is over here. And that companion cell is what contains all the organelles and is basically support for those other cells. So they work in conjunction. The other thing with these sieve tube members is that they literally have holes like a colander or a sieve that connect one to the other. And so this is what allows those food molecules to pass through and be transported through the plant. So before we get into reproduction and flowers, we're going to talk a little bit about plant growth. Now, animal growth for us is determinate. So it means that there's a certain size that is going to be the maximum. Plant growth is often indeterminate, and so that means that it continues to grow. So it continues to grow or grows throughout the plant's life. So we have indeterminate growth, and we could also talk about how plants are categorized based on how long they live. And so, you could buy annuals, and they only live for 1 year. We could buy perennials, and most of my garden is perennials because then you don't have to keep replanting them every year. But a lot of food crops are annuals, if you think of that. And then there's some weirder ones that are biennials. So biennials, my example from my garden is parsley. Feverfew is also a plant that's a biennial. And so basically what happens with them is the first year of parsley grows up into the parsley plants that I cut and bring into the kitchen. The second year is when they are the parsley plants and then they flower. And so that is that biennial life cycle. So it takes 2 years for them to complete their life cycle. If we were to talk about plant growth, there are some important regions of cell division, and lots of mitosis happens at these regions, and they're called meristems. We're going to talk about how there's primary growth and secondary growth, and there are different kinds of meristems that kind of are the location for that mitosis and that growth. So apical meristems are important for primary growth. So primary growth allows plants to grow up and down, basically. Secondary growth, as we're going to see, allows things to grow out. So the primary growth is happens at locations called apical meristems. So at the apex or the leader of a tree, or any leaf node here, these auxiliary buds, or at the tip of a root. So those three locations that I've put in red there would be apical, auxiliary, and root. Where are they? So these are all apical meristems. So that's where primary growth happens. Secondary growth is a little bit more complicated. This is lateral meristems. And so lateral meristems, again, lots of mitosis. And this growth happens between the cork cambium, or the bark, and the rest of the tree. So if we think of a log that's sliced, or a stump, and most of us have looked at that to count the rings. This is what we're talking about with secondary growth. And so here you can see the cork cambium, which we can think of as bark, right? And then that inside area that we think of as heartwood, sapwood, that kind of thing. So in these, we've got this idea of the vascular cambium and the cork cambium. And so these, in conjunction with each other, are those lateral meristems. And this is secondary growth that allows a tree to get bigger. And this idea that these annual wood rings show layers of secondary xylem. And so we've all seen that as we've maybe chopped firewood, or looked at a fallen leaf, or a fallen log. The other thing that we could do is take a look at the thickness of those rings, because that'll indicate the rate of growth of the tree. And so this is, again, secondary growth and how a plant grows out. It increases its girth. The last part of the next video is going to be about flowers and reproduction, and we'll get to that right away.